The sound of breaking glass echoed through my kitchen as the expensive wine bottle slipped from my trembling hands. Blood rushed to my ears as I heard my daughter-in-law's cruel words from the living room. Callista will probably leave us nothing but a pile of unpaid bills and that crumbling old house. The laughter that followed felt like daggers piercing my heart. Little did they know, at that very moment, I was holding the deed to my third property in Italy, a stunning villa overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. Before we go into this incredible story of hidden strength and sweet revenge, please hit that like button if you believe that quiet people often hold the most powerful secrets. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing life stories, share this video with your family and friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. I love connecting with viewers from every corner of our beautiful planet. My name is Callista Eleanor Whitmore, and at 73 years old, I had become invisible to my own family. After my beloved husband Charles passed away 3 years ago, something shifted in how everyone treated me. What once was respect turned into pity. What once was inclusion became conditional charity. You see, Charles had been a successful mechanical engineer, and I had worked as a freelance graphic designer from home for over 30 years. We lived modestly in our small 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, the same house where we raised our 3 children, David, my eldest son who became a corporate lawyer, Sandra, our middle child who works as a pediatric nurse, and Michael, our youngest, who runs a small accounting firm. But after Charles died, they saw me differently. Suddenly, I wasn't Callista the creative professional who had designed logos for dozens of local businesses. I wasn't Callista the woman who had helped put 3 children through college. I was just poor old Grandma Callista, who couldn't possibly manage on her own. The transformation in their behavior was gradual but unmistakable. David, now 38 years old, would visit maybe once a month, always with his wife Jennifer, a 36-year-old marketing executive who spoke to me like I was a confused child. "Are you sure you can handle the grocery shopping alone, Callista?" she'd ask in that patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. Sandra, at 35, meant well but was constantly overwhelmed with her own life, 2 teenage daughters and a demanding job at the children's hospital. When she did call, which wasn't often, the conversations were rushed and filled with her own stress. "Mom, I wish I could visit more, but with Emma's soccer and Lily's piano lessons." Her voice would trail off, and I could practically hear her checking her watch. Michael, my baby at 32, was perhaps the most hurtful. He had always been my sensitive child, the one who used to curl up in my lap and ask me to tell him stories. Now he avoided eye contact during family gatherings and would fidget with his phone whenever I tried to engage him in conversation. His wife Amanda, a 31-year-old real estate agent, would smile politely, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was already dividing up my possessions in her mind. The grandchildren weren't much better. David's twin boys, Jake and Mason, both 15 now, would grunt hello and disappear into their phones. Sandra's daughters, 17-year-old Emma and 14-year-old Lily, were polite but distant, clearly viewing me as an obligation rather than family. And Michael's pride and joy, his 19-year-old daughter Rachel, who was studying business at the local university, had become the worst of all, openly rolling her eyes when I spoke and making snide comments about my outdated clothes and ancient opinions. What hurt the most was how they talked about money around me. At every family gathering, there were subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, hints about my financial situation. "Mom, you know if you ever need help with the mortgage?" David would say, his lawyer voice dripping with false concern. Or Jennifer would make comments like, "These old houses are such money pits. Have you thought about downsizing to a nice senior community?" They assumed that because I drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic, wore the same comfortable sweaters I'd owned for years, and lived in a modest home, I must be struggling financially. They saw my thrift store finds and home-cooked meals as signs of poverty rather than choice. They had no idea that every cheap decision I made was actually a calculated move in a much larger game. You see, what my family never understood was that Charles and I had been far more strategic with our money than we ever let on. While our neighbors bought new cars every few years and took expensive vacations, we were quietly building an empire. Charles, with his engineering mind, was brilliant with numbers and investments. I, with my artistic eye, had an uncanny ability to spot undervalued properties with potential. It started 28 years ago, when we took our first trip to Europe. Charles had a conference in Lisbon and I tagged along. We fell in love with Portugal. Not just the culture and the food, but the incredibly affordable real estate market. We bought our first international property for the equivalent of $28,000, a small apartment in Porto that needed some work. Over the years, we renovated it during our vacations, turning it into a charming rental property that not only paid for itself, but generated a nice profit. That success led to our second purchase 5 years later, a larger house in Spain near Valencia, which we bought for $45,000 after the previous owner got desperate to sell. Charles and I never talked about these properties with the family. We weren't trying to be secretive. We just didn't see the need to broadcast our business. Plus, we wanted to make sure our children learned to be self-sufficient, not dependent on future inheritance. We thought we were teaching them valuable lessons about hard work and independence. How wrong we were. After Charles passed, I made a decision that would change everything. I sold the Portuguese apartment for $185,000, more than 6 times what we'd paid for it. With that money, plus some of our savings, I purchased 2 properties in Italy. The first was a beautiful 2-bedroom villa in Tuscany, nestled in the hills outside Florence, for $210,000. The second was a stunning 3-bedroom house in the coastal town of Cinque Terre for $275,000. Both properties were purchased under my maiden name, Callista Eleanor Davies, in trusts I'd set up with the help of an international lawyer Charles and I had worked with years earlier. As far as anyone knew, including my family, I was still just the widow living alone in the little house on Maple Street. But the treatment for my family continued to worsen. The breaking point came during what I now call the birthday incident. It was my 72nd birthday last year, and the whole family had gathered at David and Jennifer's house for what they called a celebration. I should have known something was wrong when Jennifer seated me at the card table in the corner instead of at the main dining table. "We thought you'd be more comfortable here, Callista," she said with that fake sweet smile. "It's quieter." The gifts told the whole story. David and Jennifer gave me a gift card to the local grocery store for $35. "We thought this would be practical," David said, not even looking me in the eye. Sandra presented me with a bottle of generic lotion and a box of tea bags she'd clearly grabbed at the last minute from the hospital gift shop. Michael and Amanda's gift was perhaps the most insulting, a pack of greeting cards from the dollar store and a small potted plant that was already wilting. But it was 19-year-old Rachel who delivered the final blow. She handed me a wrapped box with obvious reluctance. Inside was a used scarf that still had the thrift store tag on it, $3.50. "I thought the color would look nice on you, Grandma," she said, but her tone suggested she could barely be bothered to lie convincingly. If you've ever felt discarded by your own family, you need to hit subscribe right now. Don't just watch silently. Prove to yourself that you'll never let anyone make you feel worthless. And if you won't subscribe, at least admit in the comments why you're fine with being treated like nothing. Meanwhile, I watched them exchange expensive gifts among themselves. Jennifer showed off her new $850 designer purse from David. Sandra's daughters got the latest smartphones that cost $1,200 each. Michael presented Amanda with diamond earrings that sparkled in the light, easily worth $2,500. And Rachel? She received a new laptop for school, a $1,800 MacBook Pro that made her squeal with delight. As I sat in that corner, fingering the used scarf and listening to their excited chatter about their expensive presents, something inside me hardened. These people, my own flesh and blood, saw me as nothing more than a charity case, someone to be appeased with token gestures while they enjoyed the fruits of their success. That night, I went home and made a decision. I booked a flight to Italy. How many times have you wished for the courage to prove everyone wrong? Subscribe now, or else admit in the comments that you'd rather let people laugh at you than fight back. The choice is yours. I spent 2 weeks in Tuscany that spring, and it was like awakening from a long, gray dream. My villa, there was everything I'd hoped it would be when I bought it sight unseen. The house sat on 3 acres of rolling hills covered in olive trees and grapevines. From my bedroom window, I could see the ancient city of Florence spread out in the distance like a Renaissance painting. I hired local workers to make some improvements. Nothing too fancy, just some updates to the kitchen and bathrooms and a fresh coat of paint throughout. The house had good bones, with thick stone walls that kept it cool in summer and cozy in winter. There was a large fireplace in the main living area and French doors that opened onto a terrace overlooking the valley. The second property in Cinque Terre was equally breathtaking. This house was literally built into the cliff face, with panoramic views of the Mediterranean Sea. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below was like nature's own symphony. The house had been owned by an elderly Italian couple who could no longer manage the stairs, so they'd sold it to me for a price that would have been impossible in America. During those 2 weeks, I felt more alive than I had since Charles died. I explored local markets, ate incredible food, practiced my Italian with patient shopkeepers, and even took a cooking class with a lovely woman named Sophia, who became my first real friend in Italy. When I returned to America, I kept my experiences to myself. My family noticed I seemed happier, more energetic, but they attributed it to getting some rest, or finally adjusting to life without Grandpa. Little did they know I was already planning my return. The months that followed were filled with subtle insults and thoughtless comments from my family. Jennifer started bringing up senior living communities whenever she visited. They have wonderful activities, Callista. You'd make so many friends your own age. What she really meant was that I'd be out of the way and someone else's responsibility. Amanda began making pointed comments about my house. This place is getting too big for you, don't you think? All these stairs, and that big yard to maintain. She'd walk through my rooms like she was already redecorating, making little tsk-tisk sounds about my furniture and decor. Even Sandra, who I'd always thought was the kindest of my children, began treating me like I was becoming senile. She'd repeat things multiple times as if I hadn't heard her the first time, and she started speaking to me in that loud, slow voice people use with children or the hearing impaired. The final straw came 6 months ago during a family dinner at Sandra's house. I was in the kitchen helping with dishes when I overheard a conversation in the living room that shattered what was left of my heart. "I'm really worried about Mom," David was saying to his siblings. "She's getting more forgetful, and that house is falling apart around her." "I know," Sandra agreed. "Did you see how she got confused about which exit to take when I drove her here tonight?" "She's becoming a liability," Michael added. "What happens when she falls down those stairs? Or forgets to turn off the stove? We're going to end up responsible for whatever mess she leaves behind." But it was Jennifer's voice that cut the deepest. "Honestly, I don't know why she's hanging on to that house anyway. It's not like it's worth much, and she's probably drowning in maintenance costs. She'll probably leave us nothing but debt and problems." The others murmured their agreement, and Amanda chimed in with, "Maybe we should look into having her declared incompetent. For her own good, of course." This is the kind of moment that destroys people's spirit. If you're watching this and your heart is pounding with anger for her, smash that subscribe button. And if you won't subscribe, be honest in the comments. Why side with the ones who stripped their own mother of dignity? I stood there in Sandra's kitchen, dish towel in my hands, feeling like I'd been slapped. These people, my children and their spouses, were already planning my life like I was some kind of burden to be managed rather than a person with my own thoughts, feelings, and capabilities. That's when I knew it was time to show them exactly who they were dealing with. 3 months later, Rachel announced her engagement to her college boyfriend, Tyler, a 22-year-old pre-med student. The family was thrilled. Finally, some good news to celebrate. But then came the announcement that changed everything. "We're having a destination wedding," Rachel declared during our monthly family dinner. "Tyler's parents have connections in Italy, and we found this amazing venue in Florence. It's going to be absolutely magical." The excitement was palpable as they discussed the details. The wedding was planned for late September, during what the Italians call la vendemmia, harvest season, when the weather would be perfect and the landscape at its most beautiful. But then came the conversations I'd been expecting. "Of course, Grandma, we don't expect you to make such a long trip," Rachel said with feigned concern. "Italy is so far and there's so much walking involved. Plus, the altitude in Tuscany might be hard on someone your age." David nodded seriously. "We'll make sure to get lots of pictures and videos for you, Mom. You'll feel like you were there." Jennifer added her own thoughtful comment. "Really, Callista, international travel at your age could be dangerous. What if something happened to you so far from home?" Even Sandra, bless her heart, was worried about the logistics of getting me to Italy. "The flights are so long, and with the time change, I just think it might be too much for you, Mom." I listened to all their concerns with a patient smile, nodding along as they explained why it would be better for everyone if I stayed home. Inside, I was absolutely delighted. This was going to be even better than I'd hoped. "You're probably right," I said finally. "It does sound like quite an adventure. I'll look forward to seeing all the pictures." What they didn't know was that I'd already been in touch with the wedding venue, Villa Monteverdi, a stunning estate in the hills outside Florence. I knew it well because it was only 20 minutes from my own villa. I'd driven past it many times during my stays in Italy and had always admired its beauty. I'd also done something else they weren't expecting. 3 weeks before the wedding, I flew to Italy and settled into my Tuscan villa to prepare for the surprise of their lives. But I wasn't content with just showing up. I wanted to make this a lesson they'd never forget. So I did something that would have made Charles proud. I orchestrated the most elaborate surprise reveal in family history. First, I contacted Villa Monteverdi and spoke with the owner, a charming man named Giuseppe, who spoke excellent English. When I explained my situation, he was delighted to help. Signora Callista," he said with a laugh, "Italian families, American families, all the same. Sometimes the children, they think they know everything about the parents. No." Giuseppe helped me arrange for my family's accommodations at a beautiful hotel in Florence. All paid for in advance, of course, though they wouldn't know that until later. I also arranged for a private driver to pick them up from the airport and transport them throughout their stay. Again, all prepaid, though I asked that the bills be presented as complimentary services provided by the bride's family. The week before the wedding, I was comfortably settled in my villa, enjoying the late summer weather and putting the finishing touches on my surprise. I'd invited Sophia, my Italian friend, to help me prepare a traditional Tuscan feast for after the wedding reception. We spent days cooking and preparing, filling my villa with the most incredible aromas. I also did something else. I hired a photographer. Not for the wedding itself, but to document the moment when my family discovered the truth. I wanted this captured forever. The day of the wedding arrived with perfect September weather, sunny and warm but not too hot, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of ripening grapes from the surrounding vineyards. I woke up early in my villa, had my morning espresso on the terrace overlooking Florence, and prepared for what I knew would be the most satisfying day of my life. I dressed carefully in an outfit I'd purchased in Florence, a beautiful sage green dress that complemented my silver hair, paired with comfortable but elegant Italian leather shoes. I looked good, and more importantly, I felt good. Around noon, I drove my rental car to Villa Monteverdi. Giuseppe greeted me like an old friend, and we went over the final details of our plan. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for 4 p.m. in the estate's beautiful garden, followed by a reception in the villa's grand ballroom. At 3:30, I positioned myself in Giuseppe's office, which had a perfect view of the villa's main entrance. Through the window, I could see the wedding guests arriving, beautifully dressed people stepping out of cars and taxis, admiring the stunning venue, taking photos of the gardens and the rolling hills beyond. And then I saw them. My family. David and Jennifer arrived first, stepping out of the luxury car I'd arranged for them. Even from a distance, I could see Jennifer's amazement at the opulence of the venue. She was wearing a navy blue dress that probably cost more than some people's monthly rent, and she was clearly impressed by her surroundings. Sandra arrived next with her husband Mark, a quiet man who worked as a high school principal. Their daughters, Emma and Lily, looked beautiful in their bridesmaid dresses, though I noticed they were both immediately absorbed in taking selfies against the backdrop of the Tuscan countryside. Michael and Amanda were the last to arrive, and Amanda was practically bouncing with excitement as she surveyed the villa. I could see her calculating the cost of such a venue even from my hiding spot. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Giuseppe had arranged for me to watch from a discreet balcony where I could see everything without being seen. Rachel looked stunning in her wedding dress, a classic design that suited her perfectly. Tyler seemed nervous but happy, and I found myself genuinely moved by their vows. During the ceremony, I watched my family. They were clearly impressed by the venue, the flowers, the view, the elegance of it all. I saw Jennifer whispering to David, probably commenting on how expensive everything must be. I saw Sandra taking pictures with her phone, and Michael looking around with what I could only describe as envy. After the ceremony, during cocktail hour, Giuseppe approached my family as they stood on the villa's main terrace, drinks in hand, admiring the view of Florence in the distance. "Excuse me," he said in his accented English. "Are you perhaps the family of Signora Callista?" I watched from my hiding spot as confusion crossed their faces. David stepped forward in his lawyer mode. "I'm sorry, who's asking?" Forgive me," Giuseppe said with a smile. "I am Giuseppe Romano, the owner of Villa Monteverde. Signora Callista has asked me to give you this." He handed David an envelope with my handwriting on it. "For my beloved family." If this jaw-dropping moment gave you chills, hit subscribe. Don't just watch like a silent stranger. Show you stand with the underestimated. If you won't subscribe, at least confess in the comments why you'd rather stay on the side of those who mock than those who rise. I held my breath as David opened the envelope and read the note I'd written. "My dearest children and grandchildren, surprise. I hope you're enjoying Rachel and Tyler's beautiful wedding. As you can see, Italy is indeed as magical as they said it would be. I've been watching the ceremony from nearby, and I have to say, Rachel makes a stunning bride. I know you were worried about me making such a long journey, but as it turns out, the trip wasn't too difficult at all. In fact, I've been in Italy for a week now, staying at a place very close by. When you're ready, Giuseppe will give you directions to join me for dinner. We have much to discuss. All my love, Grandma Callista." The look on David's face was priceless, a mixture of confusion, surprise, and what I could only describe as panic. Jennifer grabbed the letter from his hands and read it herself, her mouth falling open. "I don't understand," Sandra said, looking between the letter and Giuseppe. "Our mother is in Ohio. She didn't come to the wedding." Giuseppe smiled mysteriously. But Signora Callista is very much here in Italy. She has asked me to tell you that dinner will be served at 8 o'clock. She will send a car for you at 7:30. Michael looked like he'd seen a ghost. This has to be some kind of mistake. Our mother doesn't travel internationally. She's never even been out of the country except for one cruise to the Caribbean years ago. But Giuseppe just smiled and walked away, leaving my family standing there with the letter and 1,000 questions. I spent the next few hours enjoying the wedding reception, watching from various discreet vantage points as my family tried to make sense of my message. They clearly wanted to enjoy the celebration, but I could see them huddled together throughout the evening, whispering and speculating about how I could possibly be in Italy. At exactly 7:30, The car I'd arranged arrived at their hotel. I had asked Sophia to ride along to reassure them that this wasn't some elaborate kidnapping scheme, though I'm not sure that helped much. Sophia later told me that the ride to my villa was mostly silent, with my family staring out the windows in bewilderment. I was waiting for them in my garden when the car pulled up. I'd set up a beautiful dinner table on the terrace, complete with candles, fresh flowers from my garden, and a feast that Sophia and I had prepared together. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the Tuscan hills in shades of gold and orange. But the setting wasn't what took their breath away. It was the realization of where they were. As they got out of the car, I watched the recognition dawn on their faces. This wasn't a restaurant or a rental property. This was clearly a private residence, and I was standing there as if I belonged because I did. Grandma? Rachel was the first to speak, her wedding dress still perfect despite the long day. What is this place? I smiled and walked toward them, my arms open for hugs. Welcome to my home, darling. Welcome to Villa Margherita. The silence that followed was deafening. David's mouth was hanging open. Jennifer looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Sandra was blinking rapidly as if she could clear her vision and make sense of what she was seeing. Michael was slowly turning in a circle, taking in the house, the gardens, the view, the obvious signs that this was indeed a lived-in home. Amanda was the first to recover her voice. Your home? What do you mean your home? I gestured toward the terrace, where our dinner was waiting. Come, sit down. Let's eat, and I'll explain everything. As we settled around the table, I could see them all trying to process what was happening. The villa was clearly expensive and beautifully maintained. The dinner I'd prepared was obviously the work of someone comfortable in the kitchen. The way I moved through the space, turning on lights and adjusting things, made it clear this was my territory. Grandma, David said carefully, using his lawyer voice, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Whose house is this really? I served the antipasto course, fresh mozzarella and tomatoes from my garden, prosciutto from the local butcher, olives and bread that Sophia had taught me to make. This is my house, David. I bought it 2 years ago. But that's impossible, Jennifer interrupted. You don't have that kind of money. I smiled and poured wine from my own vineyard. Yes, the property came with a small vineyard that produced enough grapes for about 50 bottles of wine per year. Don't I? Over the course of the evening, I told them everything. I explained about the Portuguese apartment that Charles and I had bought decades ago. I told them about the Spanish house, and how I'd sold both properties to buy my 2 Italian homes. I showed them the deed to Villa Margherita, with my name clearly printed as the owner. But I wasn't finished yet. I had one more surprise. Actually, I said as we finished the main course of osso buco that had been braising all day, this isn't my only property in Italy. I reached into my purse and pulled out another set of documents. I also own a house in Cinque Terre on the coast. It's where I'm planning to spend my winters. Imagine keeping quiet for years, only to reveal you own not 1 but 2 villas in Italy. If this moment left your heart racing, subscribe right now. And if you can't, tell us in the comments, why do you fear success when it's staring you in the face? The silence around the table was profound. Finally, Rachel spoke up. Grandma, I don't understand. Why didn't you ever tell us about any of this? I looked at each of them in turn before answering. Because you never asked. You never asked about my dreams, my plans, my capabilities, or my resources. You assumed that because I lived modestly, I must be poor. You assumed that because I chose to stay quiet about my business, I must not have any. You assumed that because your grandfather died, I must be helpless. David had the grace to look ashamed. Mom, we were just trying to help. Were you? I asked gently. Or were you trying to manage what you saw as a problem? Be honest, David. How many times have you and Jennifer discussed what to do about poor old Mom? Jennifer's face flushed red, which was answer enough. And you, Michael, I continued, turning to my youngest son. When was the last time you asked me about my life, my interests, my feelings? When was the last time any of you treated me like a person instead of an obligation? The shame on their faces was palpable, but I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was trying to open their eyes. Sandra, sweetheart, I said to my middle child, you're so busy taking care of everyone else that you forgot to take care of our relationship. When was the last time we had a real conversation? Not you asking if I need help with bills or grocery shopping, but a real conversation about life, about dreams, about the things that matter. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, Mom. I didn't realize. And that's the problem, I said softly. You didn't realize because you stopped seeing me as a whole person. I became just Grandma, someone to be managed and worried about rather than someone to be engaged with and respected. Rachel, bless her heart, was crying openly now. Grandma, I'm so ashamed. I've been horrible to you. I reached across the table and took her hand. Honey, you haven't been horrible. You've been young and thoughtless, which is normal for someone your age. But hopefully, this will teach you something important about making assumptions about people. As the evening continued, we talked like we hadn't talked in years. Really talked. I told them about my life in Italy, about the friends I'd made, about the cooking classes and the language lessons and the small adventures I'd been having. I told them about the peace I'd found here, and how being treated with respect by strangers had reminded me of my own worth. They, in turn, began to open up about their own lives, their struggles, their fears. David admitted that he'd been stressed about his own financial future and had seen me as a potential burden he couldn't afford. Jennifer confessed that she'd been worried about having to care for an aging mother-in-law while managing her own demanding career. Sandra revealed that she'd been so overwhelmed with her own life that she'd been trying to find ways to check Mom's care, off her mental to-do list rather than actually connecting with me. Michael admitted that he'd been avoiding me because seeing me alone reminded him too much of his own fears about aging and loss. Even the grandchildren opened up. Emma and Lily confessed that they'd been embarrassed by what they saw as my poverty and had been afraid their friends would judge them. Rachel, through her tears, admitted that she'd been angry with me for giving up after Grandpa died, not understanding that what she saw as giving up was actually me finding my own path. As the night grew later and the wine flowed, something beautiful happened. We became a family again, not the dysfunctional group of people united only by obligation, but a real family connected by love, respect, and understanding. But I had one more surprise for them. The next morning, I drove them to my second property in Cinque Terre. The coastal house was even more impressive than the Tuscan villa, perched on the cliff with breathtaking views of the Mediterranean. We spent the day there, swimming in the sea, exploring the town, and eating at the little restaurants where I'd become a regular customer. That evening, as we sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the water in shades of pink and gold, I made an announcement that surprised even me. I've been thinking, I said, about what I want to do with these properties when I'm gone. They all went quiet, clearly uncomfortable with talk of mortality. Originally, I was planning to leave everything to a charity, I continued. I figured you all were doing fine on your own and didn't need anything from me. David looked stricken. Mom, you don't have to. I held up my hand to stop him. Let me finish. After this week, after our conversations, I've changed my mind. Not because I think you need the money, but because I think these places could give you something more valuable. I gestured toward the beautiful coastline spread out before us. These houses aren't just investments. They're reminders. They're reminders that people are complex, that assumptions can be dangerous, that quiet doesn't mean weak, and that there's always more to learn about the people we love. I paused, looking at each of their faces in the fading light. But they come with conditions. Rachel laughed nervously. Conditions? Oh, yes, I said with a smile. First, you have to visit me here at least once a year while I'm alive. Not to check up on me or make sure I'm okay, but to spend time with me as equals, as family. They all nodded eagerly. Second, when these properties do become yours someday, You have to promise to use them to bring the family together, not to divide it. These places are about connection, about remembering what matters. Of course, Sandra said immediately. And third, I said, saving the best for last, you have to promise me that you'll never again assume you know everything about someone based on how they choose to present themselves to the world. Everyone has depths, everyone has secrets, everyone has more going on than meets the eye. The agreement was unanimous and immediate. As we flew back to America together, yes, I changed my ticket to fly with them. I reflected on how much our relationships had changed in just a few days. They looked at me differently now, spoke to me differently, treated me differently. But more importantly, they seemed to see me clearly for the first time in years. The change wasn't just in how they treated me either. David started calling me twice a week, not to check on my bills or my health, but just to talk. Jennifer began asking my opinion about her work projects, valuing my perspective as a fellow professional woman. Sandra started sharing her own dreams and struggles instead of just focusing on mine. Michael began including me in his social plans, inviting me to dinner parties and family events as a participant rather than an obligation. The grandchildren's transformation was perhaps the most dramatic. Emma and Lily started texting me regularly, sharing their thoughts about school, boys, and life in general. Rachel began visiting me monthly, often bringing Tyler, and we developed a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection. But perhaps the most significant change was in how I saw myself. For too long, I'd allowed their perception of me to influence my own self-image. I'd started to believe that maybe I was just a burden, maybe I was becoming irrelevant, maybe my best years were behind me. Italy reminded me who I was. The respect I received from my Italian neighbors, the independence I felt managing my properties, the joy I found in my new adventures, all of this helped me reclaim my sense of self-worth. 6 months after Rachel's wedding, I made another decision that surprised my family. I decided to split my time between Ohio and Italy, spending summers in Tuscany and winters on the coast. My little house on Maple Street would remain my American base, but Italy had become my second home in the truest sense. The family was initially worried about me living so far away for half the year, but they quickly realized this wasn't the same helpless woman they'd been concerned about before. This was a confident, capable, adventurous woman who could navigate international airports, manage foreign properties, and build new friendships in a different language. I also started a blog about my experiences as an older woman living internationally. To my surprise, it became quite popular, with readers from around the world sharing their own stories of late-in-life adventures and family transformations. The blog didn't make me rich, but it connected me with like-minded people and gave me a sense of purpose beyond just managing properties. One of my blog posts, titled "The Danger of Being Underestimated," went viral. In it, I wrote about the experience of being dismissed by my own family and how it nearly led me to dismiss myself. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of comments from people who had experienced similar treatment from family members, friends, or society in general. Many readers were older adults who shared stories of being patronized or ignored by younger family members. But I was surprised to also hear from young people who felt underestimated because of their age, people with disabilities who were constantly underestimated because of their limitations, and immigrants who were underestimated because of language barriers or cultural differences. The common thread in all these stories was the pain of being seen as less than they truly were, and the power that came from proving the doubters wrong. But more importantly, many readers talked about how the experience of being underestimated had taught them to be more careful about their own assumptions about others. A year after the wedding, I threw a party at my Tuscan villa. Not for any special occasion, just because I wanted to celebrate life, family, and the beautiful place I'd created for myself. All my children and grandchildren came, of course, but I also invited Sophia and Giuseppe and several other Italian friends I'd made. It was magical. We had a traditional Italian feast that lasted for hours, with multiple courses, lots of wine, and even more laughter. My American family mixed with my Italian friends, sharing stories despite the language barriers, united by good food and genuine affection. That night, as I watched my grandson Jake try to flirt with Giuseppe's daughter in broken Italian, and saw my granddaughter Emma helping Sophia in the kitchen, I realized that this was what I'd been working toward all along without even knowing it. Not revenge, but connection. Not punishment, but understanding. Not proving I was better than they thought, but helping them become better than they were. The evening took an unexpected turn when Giuseppe stood up to make a toast. In his charming English, he said, "To Signora Callista, who has taught us all that the quiet ones, they are often the most surprising ones." Everyone raised their glasses, but then he continued with something that caught me off guard. "But tonight, I have a surprise for our Signora Callista." He smiled mysteriously and gestured toward the villa's main entrance. "I have invited someone special to join us." I followed his gaze and saw a figure walking up the path from the driveway. As the person came into the light of our terrace, my heart nearly stopped. It was Elena Martinez, my old friend from my graphic design days, the woman who had been my business partner and closest friend for over 15 years before she moved to Spain to care for her aging mother. "Callista," Elena called out, her arms wide open. Surprise. I practically flew from my chair to embrace her. Elena and I had lost touch over the past 5 years, both of us caught up in our own life changes and challenges. Seeing her face, older but still radiant with that same mischievous smile I remembered, brought tears to my eyes. "How did you—" I started to ask, but Elena laughed and pointed at Giuseppe. "Your friend Giuseppe tracked me down through the Spanish property records," she explained. "Apparently, he's quite the detective. He found out about your house near Valencia and connected the dots." Giuseppe beamed proudly. When Signora Callista told me about her old business partner who lived in Spain, I thought perhaps this Elena might like to see her old friend again. So, I did some investigating. As Elena settled into the group, accepting a glass of wine and a plate of food, the whole atmosphere of the evening shifted. Here was someone who had known me in my professional prime, who remembered me as the creative, capable, ambitious woman I had been before I became just Grandma Callista. Elena immediately began sharing stories about our business partnership, how we had designed the logo for the largest manufacturing company in our state, how we had worked 18-hour days to meet impossible deadlines, how we had celebrated our successes with champagne and commiserated over our failures with chocolate and wine. "Your grandmother," Elena said, turning to address my family, "was the most talented graphic designer I ever worked with. She could look at a company's vision and translate it into visual art that perfectly captured their essence. We had clients flying in from 3 states away just to work with Callista." I watched my family's faces as Elena spoke. They were hearing about a version of me that they had never fully understood or appreciated. To them, I had always been mom or grandma first, with my professional life being something vague that happened before they were old enough to pay attention, before their own lives got busy, before I became relegated to the role of family matriarch. "Did you know," Elena continued, "that your grandmother designed the logos for over 200 companies during our partnership? Some of them are still using her designs today, 20 years later." Rachel looked stunned. "Grandma, I had no idea you were so successful." Elena laughed. "Successful? Your grandmother was more than successful. She was brilliant. She taught me everything I knew about color theory and typography. Even now, in my own consulting work, I still use techniques that Callista developed." The conversation that followed was unlike any I'd had with my family in years. They began asking me about my work, my creative process, my proudest achievements. They wanted to see examples of my designs, hear stories about difficult clients, and breakthrough moments. For the first time in decades, I wasn't just their aging mother or grandmother. I was Callista the artist, Callista the businesswoman, Callista the creative force who had built something meaningful and lasting. But Elena had more surprises in store. "Actually," she said, reaching into her purse, "I brought something I thought you might want to see, Callista." She pulled out a folder filled with photographs and documents. I've been cleaning out my old office files, and I found all of these. She spread the contents across the table, and I gasped. There were photographs of our old office, pictures of us working on various projects, copies of contracts for major jobs we'd completed, and even some newspaper clippings about awards we'd won. One photograph particularly caught my attention. It showed Elena and me at a design conference, both of us dressed in professional suits, standing behind a display of our work. We looked confident, accomplished, proud. I remembered that day clearly. We had just won a regional award for our innovative work on a healthcare systems rebranding campaign. "Look at you," Sandra said softly, studying the photograph. "You look so powerful." She was powerful, Elena confirmed. Callista was one of the most respected designers in the region. Companies would specifically request to work with her because they knew she would deliver something exceptional. As the evening continued, Elena shared more stories about our professional life together. She talked about the time we had to completely redesign a restaurant chain's entire visual identity in just 2 weeks, and how I had worked around the clock to create something that exceeded even the client's wildest expectations. She told them about the pro bono work we did for local charities, how I had insisted we donate at least 10% of our time to causes we believed in. She described my innovative approach to client consultation, how I would spend hours understanding not just what they wanted, but what they needed. "Your grandmother," Elena said, "taught me that good design isn't just about making something look pretty. It's about communication, about understanding human psychology, about creating connections between businesses and their customers." But perhaps the most impactful story Elena shared was about the time I had saved our business. "We had this client," she began, "a large corporation that owed us nearly $50,000 for 6 months of work. They kept making excuses, delaying payment, giving us the runaround. I was ready to write it off as a loss and move on." Elena paused to take a sip of wine before continuing. But Callista wouldn't give up. She researched the company's financial situation, found out exactly who was responsible for approving payments, and crafted the most professional, persuasive letter I've ever seen. She didn't threaten legal action or get aggressive. She simply presented the facts in a way that made it impossible for them to continue avoiding payment. "What happened?" Michael asked, clearly engaged in the story. "They paid us within a week," Elena laughed, "plus interest. And they hired us for 3 more projects over the next 2 years. Callista turned what could have been our biggest loss into one of our most profitable relationships." The pride in my family's faces as they listened to these stories was incredibly moving. For so long, they had seen me as someone who needed their protection and assistance. Now they were learning about the strong, capable, successful woman I had been, and in many ways still was. But the night held one more surprise. Elena reached into her folder one more time and pulled out a single document. "Callista, I've been waiting for the right time to give this to you." She handed me a letter with my name written in elegant script across the envelope. "This came to our old office about 6 months ago. The postal service forwarded it to my new address in Spain, and I've been holding on to it ever since." With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from the Hartwell Corporation, one of the largest companies we had ever worked with. The letter was signed by their current CEO, a man named James Patterson. As I read the letter aloud, my voice grew stronger with each word. "Dear Ms. Davies, I hope this letter finds you well. My name is James Patterson, and I am the current CEO of Hartwell Corporation. I am writing to you because of a logo you designed for our company in 1998. 27 years later, your design is still the face of our company. We have grown from a small regional business to an international corporation with offices in 12 countries, and your logo has been our constant through every change and expansion. I am writing because we are planning a major celebration for our company's 50th anniversary next year, and we would like to honor the people who have been instrumental in our success. Your logo design is not just a visual symbol for us. It represents our values, our growth, and our commitment to excellence. We would be honored if you would consider being our guest at our anniversary celebration. We would like to formally recognize your contribution to our company's success and present you with an award for your outstanding work. Additionally, we would like to discuss commissioning you to create a special commemorative design for our anniversary celebration. We can think of no one better suited for this project than the brilliant designer who captured our essence so perfectly all those years ago. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss the details of our proposal. With deepest respect and gratitude, James Patterson, CEO, Hartwell Corporation. The silence around the table after I finished reading was profound. Finally, David spoke up, his voice filled with amazement. Mom, they want to hire you again. After all these years, they still remember your work. Elena was beaming. Of course they do. Good design is timeless, and Callista's work was always exceptional. I looked around the table at my family's faces, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine respect and admiration. Not the patronizing concern of children worried about their aging parent, but the appreciation of people recognizing real talent and achievement. Rachel was shaking her head in wonder. Grandma, I can't believe we never knew about any of this. You're like this amazing secret success story. Not secret, I corrected gently. Just quiet. There's a difference. The party continued well into the night, but the dynamic had shifted completely. Elena's presence and her stories had reminded everyone, including me, that I was more than just an elderly widow. I was a woman with a rich professional history, a creative mind that was still sharp, and capabilities that extended far beyond managing household bills and doctor's appointments. Over the next few days, as Elena stayed at my villa and we caught up on years of missed conversations, my family's transformation continued to evolve. They began asking me about my current projects, my plans for the future, my thoughts on various topics that had nothing to do with my age or health. David, in particular, seemed fascinated by my business acumen. He started asking me about the real estate investments Charles and I had made, wanting to understand the strategy behind our decisions. When I explained how we had researched markets, calculated risks, and planned for long-term growth, he looked at me with new eyes. Mom, you and Dad were incredibly sophisticated investors, he said. I had no idea you understood international real estate markets so well. Jennifer, meanwhile, was intrigued by my marketing background. She began showing me campaigns her company was working on, asking for my input on design elements and messaging strategies. To her surprise, my suggestions were not only relevant, but innovative. Sandra discovered that my experience dealing with diverse clients had given me valuable insights into human psychology and communication. She started consulting me about difficult situations at the hospital, finding that my perspective on managing relationships was incredibly helpful. Michael was amazed to learn about my financial planning skills. When I showed him the detailed budgets and investment strategies Charles and I had developed over the years, he realized that my simple lifestyle had actually been the result of sophisticated financial planning. Even the grandchildren began to see me differently. Emma and Lily were fascinated to learn that their grandmother had been a successful businesswoman, and they started asking me for advice about their own future career plans. Jake and Mason began showing me respect that had nothing to do with my age and everything to do with my accomplishments. But perhaps the most significant change was in Rachel. The week after Elena's visit, Rachel drove up from the university to spend a day with me at my Ohio home. For the first time in years, she came not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Grandma, she said as we sat on my back porch drinking coffee, I owe you a huge apology. Honey, you don't owe me. Yes, I do, she interrupted firmly. I've been treating you like you're just an old lady who doesn't understand the modern world. But you're not just my grandmother. You're Callista Davies, the graphic designer. You're Callista Whitmore, the successful businesswoman. You're Callista, the world traveler, the property owner, the woman who built an amazing life. She paused, tears in her eyes. I've been so focused on who I thought you were that I never bothered to learn who you actually are. That conversation with Rachel became the template for similar conversations with the rest of my family. One by one, they each came to me, not to check on my well-being or offer assistance, but to apologize for their assumptions and to ask if we could start over. The Hartwell Corporation opportunity turned into something even more wonderful than I had expected. Not only did they commission me to create their anniversary design, but they also hired me as a consultant for their entire visual rebrand. At 73 years old, I found myself back in the business world, working with a team of young designers who were eager to learn from my experience. The project rekindled my passion for design in a way I hadn't expected. Working with modern technology while applying decades of experience was incredibly fulfilling. The young designers on the team treated me not as an elderly consultant brought in for nostalgia purposes, but as a master craftsperson whose skills were still sharp and relevant. The anniversary celebration itself was a triumph. Standing on stage in front of hundreds of Hartwell Corporation employees and clients, receiving an award for work I had done decades earlier, I felt a sense of professional validation I hadn't experienced in years. But the real triumph was looking out into the audience and seeing my entire family in the front row, David and Jennifer, Sandra and Mark, Michael and Amanda, and all the grandchildren, beaming with pride. Not the kind of pride you might feel for an elderly relative who's managing to hold it together, but the pride you feel for someone whose accomplishments inspire and amaze you. 6 months after Elena's visit, I made another decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I decided to start a consulting business, splitting my time between my Italian properties and working with small businesses on their branding and visual identity. The business took off faster than I had anticipated. Word spread about the legendary designer who was back in the game, and soon I had more clients than I could handle. I was selective about the projects I accepted, choosing to work only with businesses whose values aligned with my own. Working again gave me a sense of purpose and excitement I hadn't felt in years. Every morning, I woke up with projects to think about, problems to solve, creativity to express. I wasn't just passing time. I was contributing, creating, making a difference. My family's reaction to my new business venture was telling. Instead of worrying about whether I was taking on too much or overexerting myself, they were excited and supportive. David helped me set up the legal structure for the business. Jennifer referred several potential clients to me. Sandra helped me create a simple website showcasing my work. Michael handled the financial planning and tax implications. The grandchildren became my unofficial social media team, helping me establish an online presence that attracted clients from around the world. Rachel, who is now in her final year of business school, wrote case studies about some of my projects for her marketing classes. 1 year after the Hartwell celebration, Elena came to visit me again, this time staying for 2 weeks at my coastal property in Cinque Terre. We spent our days working on a collaborative project, a book about our experiences as female entrepreneurs in a male-dominated field during the 1980s and 1990s. You know, Elena said one evening as we sat on my terrace watching the sunset over the Mediterranean, this whole experience has taught me something important about how we see people. What's that? I asked, though I suspected I knew where she was going with this. I think we all have a tendency to put people in boxes based on 1 or 2 characteristics we can see, she mused. Your family saw elderly widow and stopped looking for anything else. But you're so much more than that. You always were. She paused, taking a sip of wine before continuing. But I wonder if you weren't doing the same thing to yourself. Had you started to believe their version of who you were? It was a profound question, and one I'd been thinking about a lot lately. I think maybe I had. I admit it. It's easy to start seeing yourself through other people's eyes, especially when those people are important to you. That's the real tragedy, Elena said. Not that they underestimated you, but that you almost started underestimating yourself. As I reflected on Elena's words over the following days, I realized how close I had come to accepting my family's limited view of my capabilities. Their constant focus on my potential limitations had almost convinced me that those limitations define me. But Italy had saved me from that fate. The independence I felt managing my properties, the respect I received from my Italian neighbors, the confidence I gained from navigating a foreign culture, all of this had reminded me who I really was beneath the labels others had placed on me. 2 years after Rachel's wedding, I hosted another family gathering at my Tuscan villa. This time, it wasn't a surprise or a revelation. It was simply a celebration of our renewed relationships and mutual respect. The difference in our family dynamics was remarkable. Conversations were richer, more balanced, more authentic. My children and grandchildren sought my opinions on important decisions, shared their challenges and successes with me, and treated me as a full participant in family life rather than someone to be managed or protected. But perhaps more importantly, I noticed that their experience with me had changed how they interacted with other older adults in their lives. David mentioned that he had started having real conversations with his elderly clients instead of just focusing on their legal needs. Sandra talked about how she now saw her older patients as complete people with rich histories rather than just medical cases. Michael had hired an older consultant for his accounting firm, recognizing the value of experience and wisdom. The grandchildren, too, had learned important lessons about assumptions and respect. Emma started volunteering at a local senior center, not to help the residents, but to learn from them. Lily began interviewing elderly neighbors for a school history project, discovering amazing stories of adventure, creativity, and resilience. Jake and Mason started including their older relatives in family activities instead of just tolerating their presence. Rachel's transformation was perhaps the most complete. She had begun working on her senior thesis about ageism in the business world, inspired partly by my story and partly by her own recognition of how she had contributed to that problem. Her research had opened her eyes to the ways society systematically undervalues older adults, particularly women, and she was determined to be part of the solution. As I write this story, sitting on my terrace in Tuscany with my laptop and a cup of excellent Italian coffee, I'm struck by how much my life has changed in just a few years. I'm no longer the invisible, pitted widow living quietly on Maple Street. I'm a successful consultant, a property owner, a world traveler, a respected professional, and, most importantly, a valued member of my family. But the most significant change isn't in my circumstances, it's in my perspective. I've remembered that age is just one aspect of who I am, not the defining characteristic. I've reclaimed my identity as a creative, capable, accomplished woman who happens to be 73 years old rather than a 73-year-old woman who used to be capable. The consulting business continues to thrive, and I'm selective about the projects I accept, choosing work that challenges me creatively and aligns with my values. I split my time between Ohio, Tuscany, and Cinque Terre, depending on the season and my work schedule. I've learned to speak Italian conversationally, made wonderful friends in both countries, and discovered that adventure doesn't have an expiration date. My relationship with my family has evolved into something richer and more authentic than it ever was before. We still have our challenges and disagreements, but now we approach them as equals rather than as caretakers and patient. They seek my advice, respect my decisions, and include me in their lives as a full participant. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to redefine yourself, to reclaim your power, to show the world who you really are. The quiet years after Charles died weren't wasted time. They were preparation for this chapter of my life, where I'm more confident, more purposeful, and more authentically myself than I've ever been. The title of this story suggests that my family mocked me for being poor, but I've come to realize that poverty was never really the issue. They mocked what they perceived as my limitations, my dependence, my irrelevance. They saw someone whose best days were behind her, whose contributions were finished, whose value was diminished by age and widowhood. What they discovered, what we all discovered, is that assumptions about people based on age, circumstance, or any other single characteristic are not just wrong, but dangerous. They rob us of the opportunity to truly know and appreciate each other. They limit our understanding of human potential and resilience. They prevent us from learning from each other's wisdom and experience. The real revelation wasn't that I owned property in Italy or had money they didn't know about. The real revelation was that I was, and always had been, a complete, complex, capable person whose worth wasn't determined by their perception of my limitations. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that quiet doesn't mean weak, modest doesn't mean poor, and elderly doesn't mean irrelevant. As I finish writing the story and prepare to send it to Elena for her feedback, we're still collaborating on projects, after all. I'm filled with gratitude for the journey that brought me here. Not just the journey to Italy, but the journey back to myself. If there's one lesson I hope people take from this story, it's this: never assume silence means weakness. Never mistake modesty for poverty. Never confuse age with inability. And never, ever underestimate the quiet one in the room. They might just surprise you in ways you never imagined. If you believe the quiet ones often hold the most dangerous and powerful secrets, subscribe right now. And if you won't, explain in the comments why you'd rather stay blind to the truth than stand with the strong. The sunset over the Tuscan hills is particularly beautiful tonight, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that remind me why I fell in love with this place. Tomorrow, I have a video call with a potential client in California who wants me to rebrand their family business. Next week, Rachel is bringing Tyler to visit, and they want me to help them plan their first anniversary celebration. Life at 73 is full of possibilities, adventures, and purpose. And the best part? My family finally sees me the way I've always seen myself, as a woman with unlimited potential and a future full of promise. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving others wrong about you. It's remembering who you really are beneath their assumptions and having the courage to show the world that person in all their complexity and strength.